morning, everyone. I know some of you, it's not morning, it's the evening. So I wish you a good evening. And it's wonderful to be here with you at Setym webinar today. Thank you very much, Jean-Michel and Jonathan, for all the efforts and all that you've done in preparing this and getting in touch with the clients all around the world, globally. As we all know, a lot has transpired in the last months and in the last 2 weeks. And with that, you can imagine the work that we do in HR, the work that we do in project management, we have to really pay attention now. We have seen incidents in the US, which has gone worldwide, and we have the participation. What I'm happy to see is the participation of people all over the world to that incident. So just to let you be aware that as we go on forward in our journeys and our different societies and countries and communities and organizations, we have to pay attention. We have to pay attention to our actions, and we have to be accountable. Okay, enough with the serious side. Right now, I would like to ask everyone to close your eyes. I would like to get us into our position right now. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Great, we're ready to go. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you. So as Jonathan mentioned, today we're looking at mitigating unconscious bias in HR and project management. I want you to know that sometimes I may ask you to answer a question, which you will put in the chat. And my wonderful colleague that's moderating, Jean-Michel, will be able to read out those to me. We've worked together as a team, facilitator and moderator, so I'm very happy to be here with Jean-Michel. So this is just a little bit of background on who I am, which you have the information, and on Jean-Michel. Let's talk about our goals. You know, we have 35 minutes, 40 minutes, and in this session, what are the things that I want to leave you with? And, you know, I could start off with the different biases that exist in the workplace. In a short session like this, I can cover a few. We will talk about that, a couple of different biases that exist in the workplace. We're going to have a real serious talk about bias and decision-making, because our decision-making can be affected by our biases. And I'll show you and go through a framework on that. How do we interrupt bias? That's the million-dollar question for a lot of organizations. Everyone's looking for tips, like what can we do to bring this awareness within our workplaces, project teams, and project program initiatives. So I want to start off today by saying, what is bias? I would like to ask you, if you don't mind writing 1 or 2 words that come to mind when you hear the word bias. If someone says to you, Jerome is biased, what comes to mind? And as they come in, I'll ask my colleague Jean-Michel to read out some of those.
Let's just give them a few seconds to write them down. wrong ideas about a person or a situation, preference on or for something or someone in particular. Unfair.
Unfair.
Unfairness, yeah. So a preference or a wrong idea, favoring one over others.
Favor.
Bias is a strong belief that I'm not open, logical thinking window about it.
Okay. This is great, and we'll go back to some of those as we go along. Jean-Michel will let me know if there are others that he wants to jump in and let me know.
Sure, sure.
So with bias, as we've heard a a lot of different things. You've talked about unfair, favoritism, a preference. So when we think of a bias, it's really a judgment. It's a decision that we make. And remember, with the bias, some decisions we make consciously and some decisions that we make unconsciously, all right? And it's always something that's contrary. So a judgment or a decision, right, based on information to the contrary. So bias, and we will talk about the different types of bias. Then we have what's called unconscious. And it's very important to understand that we all have unconscious bias, okay? This is really about quick decisions. They are based on our experience. They're based on they're just more like quick decisions. And unconscious bias, there's also the flight and fight, okay? And when we talk about fight and flight, it is, it's something that helps us, okay? So if we see ourselves in a situation, and I'm gonna use a situation about race, and I think about Jesse Jackson. You know, he was running for president one time back in the USA. He's a Black man, an activist, and he says in his own bias, and this is not unconscious, sometimes when he's walking on the street late at night, he would cross the street if he sees a group of Black youth with hoodies, all right? So that's a judgment that's made, okay? Fight or flight. So it's a protective judgment that's made because he's thinking about his health and his safety. When we think of biases, it all starts with the brain. We have 11 million bits of information at one time that is all there in the brain. But guess what? We as human beings can only process 50 bits of information. So what happens to all that other information? And a lot of the times the information we get at 50 bits, that's when we turn around and we make quick snap decisions. So think about a time that you've made a snap decision about something, someone, an incident. And think about, was it correct or was it not, as you may have found out after. So far we've talked about bias. We said bias, what they are, and we've talked about unconscious. The unconscious bias we're not aware of. They're quick. Bias are not that they're bad, but they help us with the flight and the fight. Okay, everybody, just a little summary there. So now what I want to ask you, we're going to look at different types of bias, and these exist absolutely. Project teams, program teams, and within HR. So when you look at this picture, we need to focus on diversity. Your goal is to hire people who all look different but think just like me. Jonathan has put the poll up, and we will see number 1 is A, affinity, B is confirmation, attribution, and halo. Okay, so we've got the results. We've got 50-50. And this is really great because, you know, the terminologies, this will help us to really understand. So if we look at that, we have 50-50 affinity bias and confirmation bias. And we will talk about what they both are. This is an example of affinity bias, okay? Affinity bias is, where do you see affinity bias showing up in your workplace? So this one is an example of affinity bias. What do? We tend to be attracted and include people in our circle. It could be work, project team, program team, HR, that look like us. Or they went to the same school, they graduated from the same university. My colleagues in Africa, maybe it's someone that went away to school and you all went to the same university. It's someone that maybe the parents know. You know, your parents may know someone and they have a youth, 20-something-year-old youth, 25, and they're looking for them to get into the workplace or to be on a project. So all of these things as individuals, we have to be aware of. My sister actually brought it to my attention of my actions. A couple of years ago, she said to me, Karen, I noticed that you have all these different assistants and associates that work with you. I said, yes. She says, I noticed that they're all McGill University graduates. That was such a slap on my hand. She was absolutely right. I had the affinity bias, figuring that if you went to McGill University, okay, you have all the skills, because I went there as my undergrad. I went there as my grad. I teach there, and my sons went there to daycare. Okay, I think that's a lot. So I shifted. So sometimes we have to make the shift or pivot, as we are hearing in the world right now with even COVID-19. Thank you. We're going to move on. No, right here, I'd like to stop a minute. Where do you see affinity bias showing up in your workplace? Anyone willing to share in the chat? Okay.
In recruitment.
Recruitment.
Or appointments.
Recruitment, appointments. Okay. What about anyone here that works on project management teams, program teams? We've got recruitment, appointment. Anything else you'd like to add?
No other comments for the moment.
For the moment?
Appointments
okay.
is coming, yeah. Appointments and recruitments.
Okay, so when we think of the different teams that we put together, we always think about, we have to think about affinity bias and how we put together those teams. Remember, diversity and inclusion. Research has shown that diverse teams outperform homogeneous. And homogeneous means different views of how they think. So you might have someone on a project team that may be from HR, but then you might want somebody from finance. You may want somebody maybe from communication, because these diversities of thoughts of individuals are what can make your project and your program stronger. And a lot of times we don't do that. We do what we've been accustomed to do. Now, has anyone ever heard of the halo and horn effect? Just put yes or no in the chat. I see a few responses coming.
Yes, no. No. No.
Okay, great. Another opportunity for
more or less 50-50.
50-50? Okay, super. So now let's talk about the halo and the horn effect. And this is particularly true when we think about our workplace, our project teams, once again, the halo effect. And when we think about and talk about the halo effect, it is that idea that our overall impression of people will influence how we perceive almost anything about the individual. So example, if the individual is dressed very nicely, their clothes is always ironed, nice white fresh shirt, short sleeve and slacks, we may look at that person and say, hey, he would be a great manager. Look how nicely he's dressed. Yet not knowing maybe he has other tendencies in how he communicates with his team. So regardless on all lines, because of how a person dress, or we may say that person speaks well, you know, they are going to be our leader, but it cannot be only about what they say. So once again, I'm asking you to have awareness about the halo effect. The people that their first impression influence you to think that they can hold other positions or achieve other results in the organization. Then we have the horn effect. And the horn effect is a little different. With the horn effect, we just automatically attribute qualities of them, that we attribute negative qualities to them based on very little information. Example, one that I've heard quite a bit from youth in the workplace, I would say people between the ages of 20 and 30, we call them the millenniums. We hear them say, oh, because I have an earring in my ear, it seems like I'm judged on a lot of different things. Or someone might say, oh, because, let's see, earrings are one, how person looks. And if someone doesn't socialize sometimes with other people and have lunch, we turn around and we attribute the horn to that individual. Does that make sense? Just do a check or a Y, yes, in the chat so I can move on. So that's the halo and the horn effect, and we see that very prominently in HR and project teams. Okay, let's move on. So let's look at this bias. So here, oopsie. Whoa, 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 whoa. I'm very sorry here. I have to go back.
Use the arrows, Karen.
Thank you, Jonathan. See, I need Jonathan, my technology. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, what type of bias is at play here? So what do we have? A female manager comments, I knew none of my male directors would sign up to sit on a gender equality panel. We've been asking them for the past year. What type of bias is at play? Affinity, confirmation, attribution, halo. I knew none of our male directors would sign up to sit on a gender equality panel. We have been asking them for the past year.
I think it's pretty distributed, but Most likely attribution bias, people are thinking.
Very interesting, team. Okay, well, very interesting, but this one really is confirmation bias. And when we talk about confirmation bias, this is where we search for evidence to back up our first impression, to confirm what we think. So in this comment, the woman is confirming that men are not going to participate, and her rationale reason is because they've been asked for a year. So this is an example of confirmation bias, where we search for evidence to back up our first impression. And I just want to go back with you. Affinity bias, it's also known as the similarity bias. Our tendency is to connect with others who share similar interests or background like ourselves. And then we have attribution bias. And attribution bias is really a self-serving bias. This is when we attribute all the good things that we've done to ourselves, and then the things that aren't done so well by us to somebody else. This is something else in the research that is played out a lot in the workplace. People take, the positives for what they did, but once there's anything negative, they find someone else to say that it's their fault.
Karen, an interesting question before we go on to
Yes.
Get your opinion by a comment or question asked by Mrs. Chapelier. Do you think that cloning ourselves, the affinity bias, is a biased way to prevent conflicts in the team, different point of view, and to protect our privileges?
Jean-Michel, sorry if you could just be a little louder.
Do you think that cloning ourselves, the affinity bias, is a biased way to prevent conflicts in the team, a different point of view, and to protect our privileges?
Yes, this is what people do use to protect, but it's also unfair and unjust affinity bias. I mean, you can continue, but what you will see eventually is that it doesn't bring out the best in individuals. You don't have the top talent. You don't have diversity of thoughts, diversity of minds. So if we do everything with the similar, how do we grow? How do we get those innovative ideas?
So you would say it's unproductive because that's the easy way of doing it. You don't get confronted, so you go along, but you're not gaining as much as you would if you would face opposition or being challenged. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your question. All right. So now I want to talk to you about something that's really interesting when we talk about bias and we talk about decision making. Do we all believe that there are some things that you know that you don't know? Right? Unconscious. We don't know what we don't know. And some of those things that we don't know, that's the area that can get us into a lot of trouble. So what we know is here, what we know we don't know, and what we don't know that we don't know. That's the largest piece of the pie. That's the area that we have to focus. What we don't know that we don't know. Let me give you an example. And this is around decision making. So if you may allow me, on one of my field trips to India, working with a group of engineers, as we arrived in India and we're walking through the area where the delegation is going to meet us, there are 6 men. And our team is 4 men and 1 woman, myself. As we walk by them, the men reach out their hand, the Canadian side, and shake the hands with their Indian counterpart. As I walk by and I put out my hand, nobody shakes my hand. Nobody looks me in the eye. So you can imagine what's going on inside of me. Is it because of my black skin? Is it because of my gender? Then I start to make the assumptions. You know what? It's because I'm black and I'm not Indian. It's because of my gender. I'm a woman. I just left a 5-year-old crying at the airport in Montreal, flew 20-something hours for people to treat me this way. Before I left the airport, I'd already drawn a conclusion. You know what? This is the last mission. If people don't respect me, why should I travel so far and stay 2.5 weeks in an environment where I won't be respected, right? So what happens? We make decision. This will be the last mission and I won't work again on the project. And that's how we act. Now let's go back, because who's to say I am making the decision based on the what I know. I don't know. I'm basing this on what we don't know that we don't know. I don't know why. So when I go back to this, as I'm leaving the airport, they direct me into a car with the director of HR, and she is sitting in the back seat, and I sit with her. After an hour and a half, because we're on a 3-hour trip from the airport, we start to get really comfortable talking. And I ask her, I said, why is it that the men did not shake my hand or look at me in the eye when I passed through? She said, Karen, they just bestowed upon you the greatest respect. Wow. Look what I already did. I made an assumption, I drew a conclusion, made a decision, and already had my actions. It was based on what I don't know, And that's why we have to pay so much attention to our thought process in decision making. Is it an unconscious decision? Because when things come in quickly, maybe it's time to take a pause before we make a decision so that we don't have something like this happening. Is there anyone that would like to share? Anyone went through something similar? Also think of going to a new department. No? Okay, we all want to move on? All right. All right. HR, let's talk about what's in a name. My colleagues in Africa and Asia, I want you to also think about the name. Think about the family name, how important that may be. I know in the Caribbean, where I'm from, certain family names are so very important. So people look at that. So in terms of when you get a CV or somebody recommends someone, we think about the name. Especially here in North America and in Europe, what we find is there is something to say about what's in a name. So if we look at these different names, what we notice here in North America, anyone with an ethnic name or anyone with an Anglo name. And what do I mean by Anglo? English. And I'm talking about, let's use here in Montreal. The research has shown, this was like 2014, not too long ago, but it's shown, and it's been confirmed in 2018, 2 years ago, that if a person sends out a CV with a French name on it, and the same CV a person sends out with an ethnic name, and an ethnic name, I could say something like Jamal, Hossein, and a French name could be Jean-Guy, Benoit. and the last name, Belanger. What we have found in the research is that there is discrimination, systemic, based on the name. So in your environment, I want you to think and consider the name. Is it the first name? Is it the last name? Is it the family name? Smaller communities, it's about the family name. So that's one thing that we have to consider when we look at bias. Another one, since the 1970s, the percentage of women musicians in orchestras has risen from 5 to 55%. In your chat, I'd like you to write, why do you think that is so? Why have women musicians in the orchestra, why have their participation why did their participation rise? Does anyone have any, I beg your pardon?
While we wait for the inputs of our participants, what would you comment on? Do you feel that these bias decreases as the performance indicators are more refined and the accountability is based on measurements and the market is very competitive?
Okay, that wasn't, sorry, Jean-Michel.
Again, let me re-mention it, and that will give some people the time to give us their action, their answers. These biases decrease as the performance indicators are more refined and the accountability is based on measurements and the market is very competitive. Do you think that having more refined performance indicators, a better way to measure things, can decrease these bias?
Okay, so one of the things about performance indicators, yes, it's one way, but it's more than performance indicators. It's also about within the organization, what are the values? What do you hold people accountable for? When you look at your policies, in your policies, are there aspects that speak to equity and equality? Equality is treating people the same. Equity is treating people fair. Do you have policies that speak to that? Do you have policies that speak to the human rights and protect individuals? So you have to look at all those different policies, and especially in HR and the selection of a project team. What does that policy say? Those are some of the other aspects that we really have to pay attention and make sure that they are there, and then we speak out. If something does not get addressed, we speak out and we speak up, because it's the only way within an organization to mitigate biases so all people that come to work can feel like what they have to say is valued by the organization and that they are appreciated for the unique quality that they bring. Jean-Michel, did you have some comments? Some other comments?
Yes, we had some comments done about the question, which about feminist actions, or because orchestra made a conscious effort to create an inclusive environment in orchestra for women. We have the challenge is the communication before making conclusion, but I think it was related to another comment, another question or another point you made before, and because they might change their selection process or because they've developed a diverse selection committee. So in an HR perspective.
Okay, a couple of nice things there. They changed their committee and how they select. That's a good one. But the one that's so evident for a lot of people that we don't really think about, but it is for them, is that they have to screen, so that the people that are listening to judge who should be in what position, they don't see if it's a man or if it's a woman. The second part now, what they've added is a carpet. So yes, they don't hear the high heels or the shoe, or they don't hear if somebody is walking with crutches or in a wheelchair. So these are all aspects that have been put in place to help in their selection and to make it more equitable, fair. So I'm going to move along here, looking at our time. What can we do to interrupt bias? You know, really look at, what do I know for sure about this person? Have I drawn any conclusions about this person without knowing relevant and the full facts? Have I made any assumptions about this person? Look at how I made the assumption about this project team in India because they didn't shake my hand or look me in the eye. What observations, information have I used to draw conclusions and make an assumption? Okay, here's another one. She's not great with computers. We tend to sometimes evaluate people based on age. And ageism, as we all know, could be an issue, not an issue or a challenge for some organizations that don't address it. And so I'm seeing a lot of research out there in older people want to keep working. How do we work in a collective with the different age groups? Look at Google, just showing you again some things that happen, bias. Google found that 150 of the 5 to 10% of videos were uploaded upside down. The engineers designed the app for right-hand users. What about left-hand users? Okay, so we're seeing out there in the workplace, we had to make changes. And of course, how do you manage work and raise your kids? You must be overwhelmed. An assumption that people make about women that work and take care of their family. And this can trigger false assumptions. And once, the most important, if we don't interrupt bias, changes morale of people, commitment, trust, the harmony, productivity, innovation, recruitment, and retention. I'll leave this for our question in the chat. So I encourage you to challenge your bias. I encourage you to pay attention. I encourage you to explore your own awkwardness and discomfort and engage with those you consider others and expose yourself to this different environment. There's a really nice saying that I like. We have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. And we have to get feedback from others. I am going to talk about this after, and I will take your questions. Thank you.
And a quite interesting one, I think, again, from Ms. Chapelier, is that do you feel that the competitiveness of the market is driving changes, in the sense that companies that are working hard to promote diversity are companies confronted to a very competitive market? This competitiveness is maybe more a strong driver for diversity than values. Only slogans sometimes.
Okay, so yes, the strong driver, you know, we're hearing about diversity and inclusion globally. We're talking about global countries. And right now, some of you may know about the UN 20 by 30. And the whole idea is to have women's and girls empowerment, leadership programs, educating all country states to try to do something to increase that participation of, when we think about it, women, a group that makes up about half the economy if they were working. Yes, Jean-Michel, yes, diversity and inclusion, absolutely. And also anything to do with biases and unconscious bias.
because we heard in the news lately that in Quebec, due to what's happening in the U.S., we saw the numbers about the inclusionness or not in the government of Quebec that does not reflect the real picture of the society.
Absolutely. And, you know, when we look at some of the African countries, we see that some of their government levels, they do reflect their society. So we have to look not only at society, but we also have to look at our workplace, or if we're on a project team, or if we work with an NGO, we have to look at all of those factors because they're coming to light and people are watching.
Any other questions or comments before we conclude? If you want to write them in the Q&A or...
I have a question while we're waiting for the others. I'm just curious because I know that there's a saying that says that handsome people are more successful than ugly people. Is it a cause of the halo effect? Is it because people are seeing more handsome people as being automatically more successful? Is it... I'm just curious about if it comes because of the halo effect. It's so strong that it now is a mentality that a lot of people have now.
Jonathan, that was excellent, you know, because the psychologists have done research on that. And, you know, they show that if you have this exemplary quality that an organization may look at, they think, well, you can handle other things. But guess what? When it comes to the performance management, once again, and somebody's reviewing, they're able to identify, well, this person doesn't have all those skills. I'm going to give you an example of myself. It's something that I've heard about my facilitation skills, but guess what? That's good. I teach and I facilitate. You asked me about technology and you saw me maneuver. I want someone else to be there. Another thing is my last name. My name is Karen Diaz. I worked on a project in Honduras, Latin America. And when I went to meet with the project team here in Montreal, they just saw Diaz and they knew that I worked well with their colleagues on the project in India. I walked into the room and I'm smiling and they're happy and they see me. And then they start talking, they say, hola, and I just respond. And then they start talking as we sit around a circular table. And I look at everyone. I said, I'm not Spanish. Well, they made that assumption and they wanted me because my last name.
Yes.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, are there any questions?
There's another one. There is a bias in the way that giving answers to this problem. For example, we take intermediate steps to not tackle racism in the system, diversity, ethnic, not colored perspective, gender perspective, then sexual perspective. I'm not sure what it means exactly.
If that person would like, oh.
If I may, while we're trying to, because this subject is really interesting to me, because in 2020, it saddens me that we are still talking about it. And the other question is that after the COVID-19, people are saying that for sanitary reasons, we shouldn't shake hands. And I know that some people already have biases when they see, oh, okay, he has not shaken my hand, then maybe there's something wrong. But if we don't do it anymore, if we change this fact, does that mean that hiding biases will be easier? And normally we learn from our mistakes. So if we realize that we've made a mistake where we have done a bias, which is wrong, we try to change ourselves. But if we put something in places where we more easily hide the biases, is it gonna be tougher in the future to try and make sure that there is less bias in the world?
Well, Jonathan, it's interesting what you said because there's a point. By the way, I have to take responsibility also. I'm going to another country. For me, I didn't do all the homework. Why? Because I figured, assumption, East Indian people in India, where I'm from, majority, 50% of the population is East Indian. So I made the assumption that I know the culture. So when we think about this, and that's why when we look at ourselves, we have to pay attention and say, hey, is that an assumption? Do I have all the facts? Do I have the information? So right there, we could see it was a combination. There's also that part of me. Okay.
Thank you. Yep.
And one thing I'd like to leave you all with is the Harvard, it's on the last slide. Jonathan, it is for your own self-awareness. If you could write it in the chat, Jean-Michel or Jonathan, it is the I, capital I, capital A, capital T. And we call that the implicit, IMPLICIT, association test.
So there's a website where we can see this information?
There's a website and the research, it's a Harvard implicit test that has been used to help people look at their biases. Okay, I've completed.
I think that's the first step to become.
First step, self-awareness.
Self-awareness, exactly. From there, you can move on and be more conscious of when, because we will still always have bias. I mean, it's inherent to our way of thinking and or living. But at least you have to realize the existence.
And to end, I see my colleague Joanne Saint-Ange is here with us, and Joanne wrote it in the chat. It really is a challenge for organizations and individuals. But guess what? We got to start, or we got to continue and have real actions and implementation, not just policies and guidelines. Thank you very much.
To have the history repeating itself again and again, like we're living now, and that has happened in the past years, in the past decades. So indeed, it has to change. So, well, we thank you very much, Karen, for your time. We thank you for having this discussion this morning. Thank you all for joining us this morning for this webinar. Somebody just mentioned Mr. Aqua, I'm sorry, Sakieba Vande, sorry. Can we have another webinar on the subject? If Karen is willing, probably we can have another one in the upcoming weeks or months, because I feel there's a lot of more discussion that could take place for sure.
Yeah, and one of the things I would probably add is the aspect of race, of prejudice, stereotype, the circle of that and what it means, and how we as individuals in organizations have to pay attention to that for us.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. One thing I'll just say, if you get a chance on YouTube, Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes, check it out. Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes, all right? Check that out, by Jane Elliott. Have a great day.
Thanks for giving us